Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'll continue my conversation about AP English. We are still on poetry, and today I'll be talking about a few important aspects that are necessary to really understand poetry. And that is the persona in a poem, the auditor, and the context of the poem. Now, these insights come from this collection of poetry, and it is edited by R.S. Gwynne, and this is in his introduction. So what he lays out for us is that poetry stems from the oral tradition. In pretty much all the traditions, poetry was sung, it was read in public, performed in public. So there is a performative aspect to poetry in its oral form. So when we read a printed poem, we also need to be aware of the dramatic situation that it enacts. So simply stated, who is saying what to whom, under what circumstances? This is the question we need to pose. Who is saying what to whom, under what kind of circumstances? So the first part, who is saying what, would then enable us to discern what is the persona, and that's the term. What is the speaking persona of the poem? The person whose voice you hear. It's not always the poet. The poet creates a persona who is speaking to a listener. So sometimes within the poem there will be an obvious listener to whom the persona is speaking. Now that listener, the technical term for it is auditor. Okay. Now sometimes the auditor is named, sometimes the auditor is implied. And then who is speaking to whom? The persona, the plural of which is personae, the auditor, the person who's being addressed, and the context, right? What is the occasion under which certain things are being said in a poem? And then the what part of it, of course, will be the content of the poem itself. But missing out the persona and reading the poem as if those are the poet's own thoughts would not help you in really understanding a poem. Similarly, the addressee, the auditor, not understanding who the auditor is, you might feel you are being addressed. That could complicate your understanding of it. Now, sometimes the poets would make an inanimate thing or a non-human animal as the auditor of their poem. So the famous William Blake poem, right? The tiger. So who is the auditor? The tiger himself. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry, right? Now, the auditor in this is the tiger. Now, this technique, when poets use an animal or an abstract idea as an auditor, is called apostrophe. Okay, it's spelled the same as apostrophe, but the practice is called apostrophe. So, the dramatic situation of a poem will then include you, me, and everyone else reading a poem trying to decipher who is the persona, right? For example, if you read My Last Duchess, right? Browning's My Last Duchess, which is a chilling story, right? The dramatic situation in that is that an envoy from a young woman's household is visiting the count, right? because the Count is proposing marriage to this young woman. And the Count then tells the story of his last wife, who he had murdered, right? So the persona in that is that of the Count. Obviously, it's not the poet, right? The auditor is the silent visitor who is being spoken to. The context is the context of a marriage proposal and inquiry. The larger context is the Italian feudal system, right? So, in a way, the genre of the poem is dramatic monologue, right? Because only one person, the persona of the Count, is speaking. But keep that in mind, because if we miss who is being spoken to, we could read the poetic intention in the poem if we miss the persona. We could also miss who is being spoken to if we didn't place the auditor in the poem, and if we didn't have the context. So the dramatic situation of the poem sometimes is pretty obvious. Sometimes we have to discern it, tease it out, but it is important for understanding of poetry. And do keep in mind this question: who is saying what to whom, under what circumstances? If you remember this question, then the first who will enable you to discern who the persona is, whose voice is it, right? Saying what will be the content of the poem, to whom will be the auditor of the poem, and then under what circumstances will be the general context of how the poem is staged. Now that's crucial to understand because some poems are occasional. Okay, they are written about a certain time or an event. For example, W.B. Yeats's Easter 1916 is an occasional poem, right? Then some poems are confessional. Like Sylvia Plath has a lot of confessional poems. In those poems, the poet, his or herself or themselves, are the persona. So if we tease those things out, whether a poem is dramatic, confessional, occasional, it helps us understand poetry better. So to sum up, every poem has a dramatic situation. That involves locating a persona, the person who's speaking, the auditor, the person who is spoken to, the content of the poem itself, and the context within which the poem is presented to us. And keeping an eye on these things and at the dramatic situation of the poem will help you understand those better. That's all for today. I'll continue building this series up. In the meantime, if you have any questions, if you have any good examples, please feel free to share. And if you have questions, post them in the comments, and I'll be happy to address them. Thank you so much. Stay safe, be generous and kind, and I will now see you next time. Until then, peace and love.